video after too.
I've got it recording, so barring any technical difficulties on my end, it should be okay, but I'll let you know if there is any problems.
So Alyssa was saying we had Lisa, the presenter, on the call, and then she got her internet cut out, so we're just waiting for her to come back.
Oh, jeez.
Alyssa, I'm just going to try sending a message to the people in the waiting room.
Okay. Oh, there is it says message. Is it the one that says message beside it middle?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I think that's relatively new.
Yeah, I like that feature.
You can do the same thing on a webinar.
Okay.
Yep. There's Lisa back again.
Hi, Scott. That was exciting. I'm about as low as you can get in power.
Yeah.
Possible.
Yeah, Alyssa told me you were there and then gone. So welcome back.
Yeah, I'm hotspotting it off my phone.
Oh, no.
I've been having to do that the last 2 days with my internet too. It's very
bad. I don't know why, but we seem to be good right now.
Well, Cogeco's on with us now, so I assume the Cogeco is not the problem. It must be Bell or one of the other companies.
Yeah, we don't have Cogeco in Kitchener, so I'm with Rogers. Probably Rogers.
Mine's Bell too. Oh, everybody in my house, apparently it's gone down. So there we go.
See, Chris, that's a good commercial for Cogeco.
Yeah, I need to know about the exciting deals that you guys have. You should come to the KW area.
Yeah.
Too much stress.
Alyssa, you can probably start letting people in.
I love the little doorbell. I used to have one of those when my kids would leave the house when they were little. It was so handy. I had, when they were little, a runner. She once boarded an airplane without me. I almost got thrown in out of the airport. I was trying to get her back and they're going, no, you can't get on. It's like, but you allowed this small person to enter.
It's funny with Zoom because I think you can change every other setting, but I don't think you can change that little doorbell.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a big fan of I much prefer Zoom to the Teams, but
yeah, Teams I find is good for smaller meetings, but Zoom has more functionality.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and Teams, when you share your screen, it doesn't follow wherever you go. You have to actually stop sharing and then reshare the new page. So when I'm training, if I'm trying to show something else, like a live demo, it's awkward. If anyone from Microsoft is on the call. I actually did this. When I presented with KPMG, it turns out the other guest speaker is Ricardo Wagner, who's head of D&I at Microsoft. And I was complaining about some of the functionality, and he said, call me and I'll help you fix that. So I got this one-on-one from the worldwide head of D&I using my Teams.
Yeah, I think we can get things started, and then we still have a number of people that are going to join us, but they can join in progress. And so, Lisa, I can do a little bit of an introduction, then I'll turn it right over to you. But I'm Scott McCammon, President and CEO of the Milton Chamber, and we're really proud to be a partner with the Ontario Chamber on the Discoverability program, and proud to present this webinar series. So I think we're on session 2 of 4. So it's been a great program, and those that are with us today, we hope you're going to join us for the remainder of the programs. And certainly, Lisa Kelly is an amazing resource for us in terms of knowing the subject. So with that, Lisa, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you very much. That's much kinder than if I'd written you one. That was much better. I should get you to write all my bios. Okay, so let me take us to our slides and we'll share that. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Milton's just so involved and a great partner for us, so we're thrilled. Here to talk to you on behalf of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, who employs me as a programs manager on the Discoverability Network, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, but then we're also going to talk and spend some time on disclosure and accommodations. I'm going to pause throughout the training so that if you have a question, please just, put it in the chat or open up your mic and ask me. This is a really expansive topic and we could be spending hours on it, so there's a lot to cover. But I really want to make sure that you leave having a good understanding of what disclosure is as it relates to disability, and what are accommodations and how do we provide them. Okay, so just a recap on what the Discoverability Network is. It's a system, a program that was put in place about 5 years ago, I guess. You have access through your own portal or hub called the Halton Peel Discoverability.network. And it's a job matching platform. That's kind of how it started, connecting businesses to job seekers with a disability. And it wasn't done to find people with disabilities jobs, so that's an outcome of it. It's really done to meet the needs of businesses who've reported back to us that labor market challenges are one of the big barriers to profitability and growth. Second thing is free training. So if you work with us, we will provide free training on any number of topics. I put a few up here on disability, disclosure, the AODA, on job search, on accommodations in the workplace, on inclusive recruiting, on language. So there's a real variety of topics that we touch on. So feel free to reach out to me and we can arrange that. And finally, we have networking events. In fact, I'm delighted to say that tomorrow we're going to have our very own Scott McCammon joining me tomorrow at 1 o'clock, Thursday at 1 o'clock. You can sign up through Eventbrite to talk about some of the things you're doing in your area. So what will we learn today? We're going to talk about disclosure, accommodations, and then building inclusion into business. So touch a little bit on each one. So I'm going to start with the AODA, which is the Accessibilities for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And its goal is to create an accessible Ontario by 2025. Why? Because about 1 in 5 Canadians have a disability. That includes your customers, that includes, people seeking jobs, that includes potentially some people that already work for you. So by having an accessible Ontario, it just opens up a lot of opportunity, more jobs, more customers, better services. So it's important that we understand it and that we implement the accessibility standards. And they're across 5 key areas. And basically what you're going to do is prevent and remove barriers for people with disabilities. And I'll talk about how that applies to disclosure and accommodations. And it applies to all organizations and businesses with 1 or more employees in Ontario. There's 5 accessibility standards. You can see them up here. So customer service, information and communications, employment, transportation, and design of public spaces. We are going to focus on the employment piece today because this is where generally disclosure happens. So there are slight differences if you have 1 to 49 employees in your company versus 50 plus, okay? You really need to have a plan in place for both that deals with these things as well, but this is a written version here, okay? So you're still gonna have recruitment and hiring, workplace information, talent and performance management. You're gonna communicate your accessibility policies, you know, regardless, but over here you need these things written down. Okay. The idea is that we wanna prevent and remove barriers in the workplace so that a person with a disability is able to do the job in the same way that somebody without a disability can't, or can, sorry. So let's talk about that. I am not suggesting that you hire unqualified people for your work, okay? What we're suggesting is there's a lot of qualified talent who do a great job out there. They just happen to have a disability. And if there's a barrier that's in place, we want to remove that so that they can do the best job possible. So the example I generally give, because it's the one most people think of, somebody with a disability in a wheelchair. It's actually a very small percentage of people who have disabilities. But let's say we have somebody who uses a wheelchair. And let's assume that that individual is an amazing lawyer. The only thing preventing her from being an amazing lawyer is the ability to get to her office, get into her building, or have access to an accessible washroom. So that might be barriers that are in the way that we need to address, all right? But barriers can take much different forms than just, you know, barriers in architectural design, which isn't really what we're going to talk about today. Barriers can happen in information and communications. Most commonly, they happen in attitudes. We all have unconscious bias, everybody. I'd like to say that I don't, but I do. It's how we organize the world. We have too much going on around us with all our senses and everything that's happening, and colors and dimensions and words and sounds and smells. So we create shortcuts. And these shortcuts, you know, they help us navigate. So if we see somebody like myself with white hair, we assume they are, does anyone want to chime in there? We assume they're older or more mature. It's generally accurate, but there are other people who have white hair who are not older. So that's an example of unconscious bias. We think that people with white hair are perhaps older. Or perhaps we see somebody who has long hair in our culture from behind. We tend to, in our culture, assume that that's a female because generally more females than males have long hair. Again, it's not true, but it's just something we use to organize our world. And we do this around disability a lot. An example would be when I typically ask people to talk about, you know, give me an example of a disability. The first thing that comes up is somebody using a wheelchair. And the reason is because the international symbol of accessibility is a wheelchair. And we see it painted on, you know, elevators or in parking spots. It's a visible indicator that somebody might have a disability. So that's what we go with. But in fact, a lot of disabilities, in fact, 71% of them are invisible. So we're not going to be able to look at somebody and tell that they have a disability, which is where, you know, the whole piece around disclosure becomes important. Okay. We can also remove barriers related to technology, organizational policies, and if we're a landlord, architectural design. So what is disclosure? I think a lot of people would tell you, or at least in my experience when I give this training, a lot of people immediately say, well, it's telling somebody I have a, you know, what my disability is. That is not disclosure, okay? Disclosure is when an employee or a job seeker requests a change or modification to remove a barrier so that they can do the job. Okay, nowhere in here is somebody giving you the diagnosis. Nowhere in here is somebody giving you the details of their medical condition. They're simply telling you that they have a disability and that they need something changed so that they can do their job. We do this all the time. We make changes all the time in work. In fact, 95% of accommodations, that's what we call the change or modification, we provide these to people without disabilities. So maybe it's a late start time for someone who's dealing with a personal issue. Maybe it's giving somebody an hour early to leave for a dental appointment. Right? Most accommodations are related to personal or family situations or religious accommodations. So we're already doing this, right? We do it all the time because we want our employees to do a good job. And if it helps them to go see the dentist, then we want them to do that, right? I can tell you with disclosure, generally, when I talk to job seekers or employees, they feel like, I don't want to tell my employer because it's like tiptoeing through a minefield. And when I ask employers the same thing, they say, I don't want to ask somebody whether they need an accommodation because it feels like I'm tiptoeing through a minefield. So what I want to do today is try to deconstruct that. So we're just walking across the meadow and nobody's worried about, you know, landing on a landmine, that we just feel okay and comfortable with this topic. Are there any questions or comments? Okay. So disclosure, 60% of people with a disability state that they're unwilling to disclose any information related to a disability because they fear negative consequences. So I've told you that 71% of people with a disability have an invisible disability. Now imagine that more than half of those people are working for you and they're not telling you what they need. So maybe their work isn't quite as productive, or maybe they're making mistakes, or maybe they're missing one. You'd much rather have an engaged, productive, and happy employee than having somebody who is absent or who is, you know, at work but not present, which is called presenteeism. So this should be important to you as an employer because, like anybody with or without a disability, we want our employees to be their most productive selves. Let's look at an example. I've got one here, a job seeker with anxiety. So in this case, it could easily be an employee with anxiety too. So the way that they would disclose to you is, I have a disability and I require an accommodation for the interview. So they're telling you it's related to a disability, so you know that they're entitled to that accommodation. What do they want? I'd like additional time for any assessments that you may be doing. And if possible, I'm hoping that I can get interview questions 1 hour before the session. This will allow me to better present my strengths during the interview. Now, let's just stop at those first 3 sentences. A lot of employers at this point will go, oh, yeah, that's not fair. Well, you know what? I can tell you as somebody who is an employment counselor, nobody with that extra hour of those questions can construct answers in that time. Okay, so that it's really not a leg up. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2 is, we're not hiring someone for their ability to interview. We're hiring them for their skills and abilities. So if they're going to do a better job telling us about that because they have anxiety, then why wouldn't we provide them with the questions? Now, in this case, the employer says, because it is a discussion, says, yeah, I'd be fine with giving you additional time for assessments, but I'll give you a written copy of the interview questions when you arrive, and you'll have 10 minutes to go over them prior to starting the interview. That's disclosure and that's accommodation right there. It's not very difficult. Questions? None? Okay. Just unmute if you do. The value of disclosure is that people actually work best when they're authentic and they don't have to act. So think of all the energy somebody, for instance, let's think of an invisible disability. Think of all the energy they're putting into covering or trying to fit in. So let's say they have back pain. That's one of the most common disabilities in Canada. So they're at their desk, they're in a lot of pain. They don't want to tell you because maybe you'll let them go because they feel like you'll think they're too old for the job or they're not doing a good job. So half the time they're just trying to stretch, make themselves comfortable. They don't get the report finished on time. You know, they're not particularly happy right then. Imagine if they said to you, I have a disability and I wonder if I could stretch at the top of every hour. You're going to have a far more productive employee if they can stretch than if they don't say anything. That's a common accommodation for somebody with back pain. I have that myself. That's one of the ones that I do. It doesn't cost you as the employer anything, and I suspect it'll make your employees even more productive because you've given them the opportunity to deal with that. Okay, that's just one example. People do things differently all the time. So another common accommodation is an ergonomic keyboard. Again, well worth it if somebody has, say, carpal tunnel syndrome where they have, you know, pain on their wrists. That's much easier to buy them an ergonomic keyboard than to, you know, find a new candidate, train them, you know, and hope that they like your company and are willing to stay on. So accommodations actually enhance productivity. It's not about making do, they're just trying to be productive. Trust me, nobody asks for an accommodation because it's an extra. It's just what they need to do their job. And why would we not want to give our employees the tools that they need to do their job? Flexibility as an organization. So when people do things differently, that means we have to be a little flexible in our approaches. But that can help you address changing circumstances and contexts and keep you nimble. So let's think of COVID now. We've had to all switch, or a lot of us switch to move, you know, working from home. For those of us that are frontline, maybe we're working behind screens or wearing masks. That's required flexibility, okay? And when we have people who do things differently, so I'm going to use the example of the chamber, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. I've worked from home a lot because of my disability, and I've worked a lot remotely. So I think there's 3 of us that have Zoom accounts. I'm completely comfortable setting up Zoom calls, monitoring them, delivering over it, managing all the attendees, right? There's only 3 out of about 50 of us that are comfortable doing that in our organization. It's because I do things differently. I'm comfortable with this. I've done this for a long time. And it's because of my disability. So there's a really good example of how when people do things differently, it can actually be more productive. Noise canceling headsets were created for people with disabilities. We all use them now. Closed captioning. So there's lots of examples where common accommodations actually end up working well for everybody. And again, if somebody needs noise canceling headsets because it's too noisy around them and they want to concentrate, that's actually a beneficial thing. They allow us also to plan and provide appropriate supports for our existing workforce. So if we know that about 1 out of every 5 of our employees is asking for noise canceling headsets, maybe we just make that a standard tool and we budget that in. 95% of workers, like I said, requesting accommodations do not have a disability. So people with disabilities, and only 60% of them, you know, are not everybody with a disability will ask. So of this 5% of accommodation requests related to disability, not everybody with a disability is going to ask for an accommodation. And 60% of this 5%, it's going to be a charge of nothing. It costs you nothing. It's just about being flexible. The next 93%, well, the total of 93% of this 5% is a one-time cost of $500 or less. Accommodations are not extras. So if you leave with one thing today, that's what I want you to remember. People asking for accommodations aren't asking for something special. It's just what they need to do their jobs. It's what they need to enhance their productivity. And again, those accommodations can be changes to attitudes or processes or the workplace so that somebody with a disability can do their job. Essential duties of the job are still done. Okay, so this isn't about, oh, you don't have to do the work. Oh, you're not able to do the work. You need to hire somebody who's able to do the work. They just might do it a bit differently. Standards are not lowered. Things just may be completed in different ways. So, you know, on our team at the Chamber, we have a number of people who've disclosed they have disabilities, and they've done that publicly. So, for instance, we have someone who is blind, legally blind, totally able to do the job, does a phenomenal job. It's been a great hire. Okay. Now, things are done a little bit differently. They use a different computer and they use assistive technology. That's okay. They actually brought that to our organization. We actually didn't even need to provide it. Here's another example. I like this slide, this source because it's more recent. It's from 2019. So in this example, 19% of the businesses reported no cost. So lower than the figure that I quoted earlier, which was from an ongoing longitudinal study. 50% report that it costs between $100 and $500. Okay, but look at that next figure. 25% of companies report saving anywhere between $20,000 to $100,000 because of effective accommodations. And all the employers reported a return of $28 for every dollar they invested in accommodations. This is just smart business. This isn't extras. This isn't special treatment. It's just allowing people to do the jobs you've hired them for. So what are some common accommodations? Okay, well, flexible work arrangements is the number one. So maybe somebody starts an hour early. Maybe they work a shortened day. Maybe they work alternate hours. Maybe they work one day a week from home. Okay, those would all be examples of flexible work arrangements. I find this really interesting because a lot of businesses prior to COVID were saying we can't do work from home. And we've all learned that the majority of us can. So it's a really good example of how we have a lot to learn from diverse viewpoints. The second most common accommodation is a workstation modification. So maybe an ergonomic chair or an ergonomic keyboard, or hands-free headsets. And the third is human or technical supports. So maybe an assistive device like JAWS. Any questions?
Lisa, we have one question that's come in.
Great.
So if somebody has a disability, but they haven't necessarily had a medical diagnosis, how would they then try and get a work accommodation?
They would ask for one and they would be entitled to one.
And there's no medical proof.
We do not ask people for medical proof. Okay, so when someone discloses, they're going to tell you they have a disability. Okay, and you're going to take that at face value. When we can ask for medical proof, and I don't recommend going that route, we would ask for details related to the accommodations we have to provide. So we might contact a medical professional and say, this person tells me that they can't lift. Can you tell me how much they are able to lift and how frequently? You're still not going to get the medical diagnosis. You're not going to get their treatment protocol, but that medical professional might be able to say, well, Alyssa can lift 25 pounds, you know, once a day or, you know, 3 times a day. So the only time we ask for medical proof is when we needed details to help us provide an accommodation. Does that answer the question?
It's perfect. Thank you.
No problem. I get a lot of people pushing back sometimes, not so much employers, but peers, other people in the company going, but why does she get that? Why, you know? So that can be more challenging than providing the accommodation. And I think, you know, in that case, what we need to do is you can call me in, I'll give some disability training to your general workforce. But generally, I think what we have to say is this person requires a change. That's between me and them. Thank you for, you know, asking, but that would be private and confidential information. And, you know, that's typically a big one that employers ask about. There's different ways to, you know, to word that and address that. Employer responsibilities. Well, which was the question, accept the request for accommodation in good faith. So we're not asking for proof. Get expert opinion or advice where needed, but not as a routine matter, okay? So we're not gonna do this every time. All right, so you're only gonna get it where you need it to be able to provide the accommodation. I want you to take part in considering a range of options and solutions. So my boss is Louis De Palma. I use this example because I don't mind sharing it, and I actually think it's really indicative of how accommodations work. I have a disability. I told Louis when he hired me that I did, but that I did not require an accommodation. A week into starting, I required an accommodation. Our office is really noisy. It's very busy. And I work in an open concept part. And unfortunately, that just kind of made my disability, it made it very difficult for me to work. So I went to Louis and I said, Louis, I told you I have a disability, which I do. I now require an accommodation. Can I have an office? And Louis said, no, you may not have an office, Lisa. However, tell me what, you know, tell me what the problem is. And I said, I'm finding it overwhelming. It's very, very noisy. It's very busy and I can't concentrate and I can't do my work. So that's my barrier. It's noisy. So Louis bought me these. It's like a $50 fix. And it turns out everybody in our company, whether you have a disability or not, tends to use these. So it's just, you know, common across the office. Now at times, so Louis accommodated me. You can see I came with the request for my own office, which I think is perfectly reasonable. Not really, but it's a joke between Louis and I. And Louis came back and said, no, I think these should cut down the noise, which they did. But sometimes it was still too noisy. So about a month later, I went back to Louis and said, yeah, but there's still parts of my job where it's just still too noisy and I can't concentrate, particularly when I'm training. Now, Louis wants me to train. That's what he's hired me to do. So in that case, he said, book off one of the private offices, Lisa. So we do have private offices. So I started doing that. Now, not everybody in our company at that time knew I had a disability, and they started seeing me book off a private office. So everybody else started booking off a private office. And it ended up, you know, that I couldn't get a private office anymore. So for those occasions that I needed it. So in that case, what Louis said is you can work from home on those days. Just let me know. So you can see it's a discussion. There's no, Lisa, give me proof that you need this, you know, that you're bothered by noise. There's no getting an expert opinion. He knows I want to work. I know I want to do the job. So then it became a conversation between the two of us on options. And I'm fine with I love the noise canceling headsets. I use them even in my very quiet home now. And Louis was happy because I was able to do my job. And that's a really good example of how somebody can, you know, an accommodation pathway. It's not going to always be you'll get it right the first time, but, you know, the objective is to cut down the noise for me so I can do my job. Any questions on that? Now, sometimes it's going to happen. You're going to, so Louis engaged in the range of options and solutions. We keep a record, right? So Louis just writes down, Lisa requires headsets and occasionally will work from home. But he also has to maintain confidentiality. So that comes back to that piece where I told you about, you know, I was signing out offices and then everybody else started to. So that can be difficult. because the other employers are going, well, why is Lisa always booking them out, right? And if I don't want that shared across the office, you do have an obligation to maintain confidentiality. Now, I ultimately chose to share that I have a disability, so that took some of the pressure off, but Louis also gave me the option of working from home in case I didn't want to confine. You want to consult with the actual person to determine the most appropriate accommodation, and you talk to them regularly and make sure it's, amiably. Implement the accommodations in a timely way to the point of undue hardship. So undue hardship's pretty high bar. So, if it's going to bankrupt you, or you're going to have to lay off other people, or it's affecting health and safety, that's undue hardship, okay? But that's a legal question. You'd want to refer to a lawyer for that. And ideally, we don't want to get to the point where we're having such a disagreement that this becomes an issue. You cover the cost of any required medical information. So if you do require a doctor's note to know what the restrictions are on a person, on what they're able to do or not, you pay for that. And you do pay for the cost of the required accommodation. Okay, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions here. No? Okay. You're going to create accommodation plans. Now, if you don't have, if you don't feel comfortable writing out accommodation plans, the great thing is if you go on our websites, we have examples of these and templates you can download for free. Conference Board of Canada put together what I think are some of the best templates for these kinds of things, including return to work, notes to medical professionals, accommodation plans, and that's all available on our website. We've curated what we think are the best ones. So you can just fill it out. You can also simply just have a piece of paper that says, I'm going to provide Lisa Kelly with a pair of headsets. We are going to talk about it every 6 months to ensure it's working. Okay, doesn't have to be complicated. I would actually ask everybody when they start, do you require an accommodation? So that it just becomes embedded and it's not something out of the norm, and we're not making assumptions about who does and doesn't have a disability. This is a good thing to know for every one of our employees and to ask every year, not just once. Every time you have a review, do you now require an accommodation? As people age, things come up. Maybe they develop a neurological condition. Maybe they develop diabetes, right? And they require a refrigerator to store their medication. That's okay, but you will want to know about that. So just ask every year, do you require an accommodation? And don't make it something that's just for people with disabilities. If requested, you'll provide information in accessible formats and communications. So accessible formats, large print, or if somebody uses assistive technology, you want to make sure that it is readable by the software. You will have an individualized workplace emergency response information. So if that person requires help in the case of an emergency, what are you going to do? And then again, information about the accommodations, the workstations, the scheduling, structural, anything that you need. All right, what are the steps to doing this? Let your employee know that here's what our accommodation policy is. When it's requested, gather information, figure out what's the best option, develop the plan, what do you need? When am I going to provide it? Keep it secure and confidential. And then you're just going to implement it, monitor, check in with the person and review it. It's not difficult. Documented accommodation plans, the process, again, I'll provide this deck to you so that you have a copy of this. It looks like there's a lot of steps here, there really isn't. So when you have a process, you want to say, how can this person participate in developing the plan? So the very first thing you could say is, I'm going to ask the person. Where's the gap? Where's the barrier? That would be filling this section. How an employee is assessed on an individual basis. How you can request an evaluation if needed. Okay, and again, I've got a form on the website that you could download. How they can request representation from a bargaining agent, a workplace representative, or others if that's applicable. what steps you're going to take to protect their privacy. So in this case, I'm going to keep it in a locked file cabinet. I'm going to tell HR, not to share this information. How often you're going to update it. So we will review this every 6 months. If the accommodation plan is denied, how will that denial be provided? Are you going to speak? Are you going to document it? And then finally, the means of providing the plan in a format that is accessible if the person needs it. Any questions on this?
Lisa, you talked about the accommodations may change,
yes,
over time. And I would have to imagine that that during COVID, it's a couple of things that probably happened. One is that it may have revealed some necessary accommodations. Not just working from home, but other accommodations that people may need. But at the same time, it may have also hidden the need for accommodations because now the employer doesn't see people on a regular basis.
That's right.
So are you seeing that, and how to?
Yeah, we are seeing that, in particular in the area of mental health. So, this is a big piece. We're seeing, I think, not the chamber, but just all the documentation is showing that there is an unprecedented mental health crisis. There is a lack of access to supports. So you may need to think of some ways that you could provide accommodations that maybe you haven't thought about before. So for instance, having 5 to 10 minutes before a meeting where people just get to chat, right? So they're not always meeting, putting gaps between meetings so people have a chance to rest, limiting the number of meetings you have. At the chamber, Louis was really amazing. He lets us have a 1-hour games event every Friday, right? Just to build bonds, feel less isolated. We're connecting, but it doesn't have to be about work. So those would all be, accommodations. They weren't asked for in particular, but it was to try to help circumvent, any potential mental health. We also brought in a mental health expert and did a webinar on that. That might be an idea. And yes, context. So if somebody's moving locations can change. And also so can, just the person's normal experiences as they go through life. Maybe somebody develops a disease or a condition that we've not thought about before. Maybe for some people, it may be much easier to work from home and they're going to want to do that in the future. So, you're going to want to be thinking about that too. I'm hearing from a lot of employers that, a lot of the workforce is actually pretty happy being at home and gaining the extra time in terms of commuting. But then I, as an employer, would start thinking about, well, I don't want them. There's been a real merging of your personal time into your work time. And so setting some boundaries around that so you don't get burnout. But that's an excellent observation, Scott. Any other comments or questions? Okay. How do you encourage disclosure? Number one, educate your staff. I'm happy to come in. I'm happy to arrange a webinar for everybody's staff that they can join about disclosure, what it is, not to be assuming somebody on the other end is, having difficulties or getting extra privileges. Can talk about all the, dig down deeper into the whole unconscious bias piece and, talking about disability. Create a safe environment. So that means, not making faces. If somebody says, hey boss, I have IBS, I need to be near a washroom. Right? IBS is irritable bowel syndrome. Not making faces. The person's never going to speak to you again if you're crinkling up your nose or you're telling kind of jokes or using language that isn't appropriate. So I really encourage employers to tell everybody at a company meeting, we are open to providing accommodations. That is part of our policy. We'll be asking everybody to complete an individualized accommodation plan. If you don't need an accommodation, great. But if you do, that's just a normal part of doing business. We want you all to feel productive. and your best self at work. Focus on what people can or cannot do. That's what I mean by focus on function. So we're not focusing on diagnosis or medical details. We're helping them do the primary pieces of their job that they need to do, right? So if somebody needs to type and they're having pain, then they might need a chair, a saddle chair like I have, or they might need a computer stand, right? That's focusing on the function, not trying to fix my disability. Share how you're going to protect that information and really use better language. So I don't love undue hardship. I don't like reasonable accommodations because I think they kind of send signals like we're doing this because it's the law, not because we actually value you. So you could say, do you require an accommodation for the workplace related to a disability? Because we want to help you be your best here at, and then name your company. That's a much better way because you're talking about helping that person do their job, allowing them to do their job instead of making it sound like a legal box you have to tick. I'm going to stop sharing. There's all my contact information if you need it. And I'm going to suggest at this point we stop recording, and then if people have questions, Scott, we can have them off the video recording.
Sure, that makes sense. I'll have to rely on Alyssa to do that. She has the control.
Okay, Alyssa, if you don't mind.